The first rays of dawn crept across the horizon, casting golden light over the parched plains of Wyoming Territory. 1876. Jolene Callaway strained against the ropes that dug into her wrists, her once fine blue dress now tattered and stained with dust. The three men who had abducted her 2 days prior argued loudly by the campfire, not bothering to lower their voices as they discussed her fate at the upcoming slave auction in the lawless border town. Tears streaked clean lines down her dirt-covered face as she realized this could be her last sunrise as a free woman. The tallest of her captors approached, his face twisted into a cruel grin. "Up and at 'em, pretty lady. Got a big day ahead. Lot of men gonna be real interested in a fine-looking woman like yourself." Jolene lifted her chin, refusing to let him see her fear despite the trembling in her hands. "My father will find you. He'll pay whatever ransom." A harsh laugh cut her off. "Ain't no ransom, darlin'. Your daddy's ranch is finished after that fire. You're worth more to us sold outright." The men hauled her to her feet and secured her to the saddle of a sturdy bay horse. The rope burns on her wrists stung with every movement as they rode toward the rising sun, toward a fate she couldn't bear to contemplate. After 2 hours of riding, they approached a small gathering of buildings that seemed to rise from the dust itself. Willits, Wyoming was little more than a waypoint for those heading west. A collection of weathered structures including a general store, saloon, and livery stable. It was also known for its irregular commerce that took place just outside the reach of federal marshals. As they rode in, Jolene noticed a tall figure leaning against the hitching post outside the saloon. His hat was pulled low over his eyes, but she could sense him watching as they passed. Unlike the other men who openly stared at her with hungry eyes, this man's gaze felt different, calculating, observant. The auction block was nothing more than a wooden platform hastily constructed at the edge of town. 2 other captives, a Chinese man and a young Native American woman, already stood with heads bowed as a crowd began to gather. "Get a good price for this one, Harlow," the leader of her captors said to a greasy-looking man with a ledger. "She's educated, can read and write and play piano. Daughter of that rancher Callaway from over Cheyenne Way." Harlow grabbed Jolene's chin, turning her face roughly from side to side. "Pretty enough. Should fetch 300 at least." Jolene was pushed onto the platform, the morning sun now beating mercilessly on her head. The crowd of men, mostly rough-looking traders, miners, and drifters, grew as Harlow began his patter. "Next up, gentlemen, a fine specimen of womanhood. Educated, cultured, and with plenty of good years ahead of her. Bidding starts at $200. $250. Shouted a voice from the crowd. $300, called another. Jolene scanned the faces desperately, looking for anyone who might help, anyone who appeared different from these cruel men. Her gaze landed on the tall stranger she'd noticed earlier, now standing at the back of the crowd. He wasn't bidding, just watching with a hard expression. $500. The bid came from a corpulent man with a sweaty face and small, cruel eyes. The crowd murmured it was a high price, $500 going once. Harlow called, raising his arm. $600. A calm voice called from the back. The crowd parted to reveal the tall stranger, now stepping forward. He wore a long duster coat despite the heat, and Jolene could now see his face clearly, strong-jawed, with piercing blue eyes and several days' worth of stubble. "Zeke Irwin," someone murmured in the crowd. "What's he want with her?" the fat man sputtered. $700. $8, countered Zeke without hesitation. The bidding continued until it reached an astonishing $1,000, with Zeke coolly outbidding the increasingly angry fat man. "Sold," Harlow finally shouted, bringing down his hand with a flourish. "To Zeke Irwin for $1,000. Jolene felt sick as she was pulled from the platform and handed over to her new owner. Up close, she could see the man was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30, with lines around his eyes that spoke of years squinting into the sun. He paid with a stack of bills, then took her rope lead without a word. Instead of heading toward the hotel like she feared, he led her to the general store, stepping inside with her in tow. "Need a knife," he said to the shopkeeper, who eyed Jolene warily but handed over a small pocket knife. They stepped back outside, and Jolene braced herself for whatever was to come. But to her shock, Zeke pulled her into the narrow alley between buildings and immediately cut through the ropes binding her wrists. "You're free, Miss Callaway," he said quietly, "though I suggest you don't run just yet. Those men are still watching, and they wouldn't take kindly to losing their profit." Jolene stared at him in disbelief, rubbing her raw wrists. "Why would you? Those rope burns need tending," he interrupted, glancing at her injured wrists. "And you need food and proper rest. My homestead's a half-day's ride from here. You can recover there before deciding where to go." "You just spent $1,000 to free me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Been saving for something important. Reckon this qualifies." He removed his duster and draped it over her shoulders. "You're under my protection now, Miss Callaway. To the rest of this town, you're mine. But between us, you belong to no one but yourself." For the first time in days, hope flickered in Jolene's chest. She nodded, understanding the charade was necessary for her safety. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Yes. My father raised me on horseback." "Good. Follow my lead, keep your head down, and don't speak to anyone." They walked toward the livery, Zeke's hand resting lightly on her back, possessive enough to satisfy onlookers, but gentle enough to reassure her of his intentions. His horse, a magnificent black stallion, was already saddled, and he purchased a sturdy chestnut mare for Jolene. The fat man who had bid against Zeke approached as they prepared to leave, his small eyes narrowed. "Mighty generous price for a woman, Irwin." Zeke continued checking the cinch on Jolene's saddle. "My business, Thatcher. Heard her daddy's ranch is burned out. She ain't worth the money." "Then you should be glad I outbid you." Zeke's voice remained even, but Jolene noticed his hand drift closer to the revolver on his hip. Thatcher spat on the ground. "You always were a fool with your money, Irwin. Enjoy her while she lasts." After the man walked away, Zeke helped Jolene mount, his touch respectful. "That's Edgar Thatcher. Owns the biggest cattle operation north of here. Not a man to cross lightly." They rode out of town at an unhurried pace, maintaining the pretense that she was simply property being transported. Only when Willits disappeared behind them did Zeke increase their speed, leading them off the main trail and into the rolling hills. "Where are we going?" Jolene finally asked when they stopped at a stream to water the horses. "My place is near Elk Creek, about 15 miles from here. It's isolated. You'll be safe there while you heal and figure out your next steps." He handed her a canteen. "Your father's ranch, is it true what Thatcher said?" Jolene took a long drink before answering. "Yes. 3 weeks ago our main house and barn burned. My father was injured trying to save the horses." Her voice caught. "While he was recovering, those men came. They said they were collecting on a debt. When my father couldn't pay, they took me instead." Zeke's expression darkened. "That's not how debts work in civilized places." "Willits doesn't strike me as civilized." "It's not," he agreed. "But even in the territory, there are laws against what happened to you." They continued riding through the afternoon, Jolene growing more exhausted by the hour. When they finally crested a hill to reveal a modest homestead nestled in a sheltered valley, she nearly wept with relief. The cabin was larger than she expected, built of solid logs with a stone chimney. A corral held several horses, and a small creek ran nearby. A garden plot and chicken coop suggested self-sufficiency. "It's not much," Zeke said as he helped her dismount, "but it's secure. No one comes here uninvited." Inside, the cabin was surprisingly comfortable, clean, and well organized with sturdy furniture. A stone fireplace dominated one wall and shelves lined another, filled with more books than Jolene would have expected a homesteader to possess. "You can take the bed," he said, nodding toward a curtained alcove. "I'll sleep by the fire." "Mr. Irwin, I can't possibly—" "Zeke," he corrected. "And yes, you can. You've been through an ordeal, Miss Callaway. Rest is what you need now." He busied himself preparing a simple meal while Jolene explored the small cabin. On the bookshelf, she found volumes of law texts alongside poetry and novels. "You're educated," she observed. He glanced up from the stove. "Went to law school back east, practiced for a few years in Boston." "What brought you to Wyoming Territory?" A shadow crossed his face. "Looking for something different, something real." After they ate, Zeke brought out a small tin of salve. "For your wrists," he explained. "It's my mother's recipe, good for rope burns." His fingers were surprisingly gentle as he applied the cooling mixture to her raw skin, and Jolene found herself studying his face. There was kindness there beneath the weathered exterior. "Why did you help me?" she asked directly. Zeke was quiet for a long moment. "5 years ago, my sister disappeared on her way west to join me. I later learned she'd been taken by men like those who took you. I never found her." He secured the bandage on her wrist. "I couldn't save her, but I could save you." That night, Jolene slept in a real bed for the first time in days, exhaustion finally overtaking her fear. She dreamed of fire and ropes and auctions, waking with a gasp in the darkest hour of night. Through the curtain, she could see Zeke sitting by the dying fire, a book open in his hands, keeping watch. In that moment, despite all logic and propriety, she felt safer than she had in weeks. The next morning, Zeke was already outside when Jolene woke. She found him in the corral, working with a young colt. She watched from the doorway, impressed by his patient, firm approach with the animal. "Good morning," she called when he finished. He nodded in acknowledgement. "There's coffee inside. And I left some clothes that might fit you better for riding." The clothes, a simple shirt, vest, and trousers, had clearly belonged to a woman, though they were a bit large for Jolene's frame. "My sister's," Zeke explained when she emerged wearing them. "Kept them thinking someday." He didn't finish the thought. After breakfast, he showed her around the property. Despite its isolation, the homestead was remarkably self-sufficient, with a springhouse for keeping food cool, a workshop where Zeke made furniture in the winter months, and even a small apple orchard just beginning to produce fruit. "You've built all this yourself?" she asked, impressed. "Most of it. Traded work with neighbors for the bigger projects." "It's wonderful," she said sincerely. "But I don't want to impose on your hospitality. If you could take me to the nearest proper town with a telegraph office, I could contact my father's friend in Cheyenne. He would help me get home." Zeke leaned against the corral fence. "I'll take you wherever you want to go, Miss Callaway, but I'd advise waiting a week or so. Those men who sold you might be looking, and Edgar Thatcher seemed particularly interested. Better to let things settle." The idea of staying longer both relieved and unsettled her. "I couldn't possibly repay your kindness, not asking for payment," he interrupted. "But if you're determined to contribute, I won't turn down help with the garden and cooking. Been living on my own, cooking too long." Over the next several days, they fell into an unexpectedly comfortable routine. Jolene took over the kitchen, grateful to discover she remembered more from her mother's cooking lessons than she'd realized. Zeke worked the property during the day, returning for meals they shared over increasingly easy conversation. She learned he'd come west after the war, disillusioned with the law practice he'd built in Boston. His sister had planned to join him after their parents died, but never arrived. He'd spent 2 years searching for her, before finally settling on this isolated homestead. In turn, she told him about growing up on her father's ranch, about losing her mother to influenza 5 years earlier, and about her dream of someday becoming a teacher. "My father wanted me to marry the son of a business associate," she confided one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "That's partly why I was traveling to Cheyenne to meet the young man and his family." "And did you want that marriage?" Zeke asked quietly. Jolene shook her head. "I'd never even met him. Father said it was a good match that would secure our ranch's future." She sighed. "Now with the fire and everything that's happened, I don't know what awaits me back home." On the 7th day of her stay, Zeke rode into the nearest proper town, Meadow Creek, to purchase supplies and gather news. Jolene spent the day baking bread and tending the garden, surprised by how at home she felt in this place that had been a stranger's home just a week ago. When Zeke returned, his expression was grave. "There's a notice out about you," he said without preamble, handing her a folded paper. "Not from your father." The notice described her as a runaway servant with a reward offered for her return to Edgar Thatcher. "He's claiming I belong to him." Jolene's hands trembled with indignation. "He's a powerful man in these parts, owns half the county officials." Zeke ran a hand through his hair. "I asked around carefully. Seems your father's ranch was foreclosed upon after the fire. Thatcher bought the deed." "That's impossible." "The ranch has been in my family for 20 years. According to town gossip, your father took loans from Thatcher last year after the drought affected your herd. The fire was the final blow." Jolene sank into a chair, the implications hitting her. "Those men who took me, they must have been working for Thatcher all along." Zeke nodded grimly. "I suspect so, and now he's trying to claim you as part of the property." "But that's not legal. I'm a free woman, not property to be transferred with land. You and I know that. But out here with corrupt officials in his pocket." Zeke's voice trailed off. "Did you send word to your father's friend in Cheyenne?" "Not yet. You said to wait." "Good. Better he doesn't know your whereabouts for now." Zeke paced the small kitchen. "We need to prove Thatcher's actions are illegal. If your father was coerced or defrauded—" "You said you were a lawyer," Jolene said, hope rising. "Could you help?" Zeke stopped pacing. "It's been years since I practiced, and Thatcher has resources we don't. But you understand the law. You could advise me, at least." He nodded slowly. "I'll do what I can. First, we need documentation of your father's dealings with Thatcher, and we need to ensure your safety while we gather evidence." That night, lying in bed, Jolene realized her situation had fundamentally changed. She wasn't just recovering from an ordeal before returning home, she had no home to return to. And the man who had purchased her freedom was now risking his own safety to protect her from a powerful enemy. Sleep eluded her, and she eventually rose to make some tea. She found Zeke still awake, sitting at the table with papers spread before him, making notes by lamplight. "You should rest," she said softly. He looked up, the lamplight casting shadows across his face. "Just refreshing my memory on Wyoming Territory property law. It's been a while." She sat across from him. "Why are you doing all this for me? You've already done more than anyone could expect." Zeke set down his pencil. "When I came west, I was running from something, from the person I'd become. In Boston, I was successful, but I'd compromised too many of my principles. Represented clients I knew were corrupt because it advanced my career." He looked directly at her. "Out here, I thought I could start fresh, live honestly. Then I lost my sister, and for a long time I just existed." "And now?" she prompted when he fell silent. Now I've found something worth fighting for again." The intensity in his gaze made her heart flutter unexpectedly. She'd noticed his handsome features from the beginning, but in this moment, she saw something deeper, a fundamental goodness that drew her to him. "We should try to get some sleep," he said, breaking the charged silence. "Tomorrow we need to plan our next steps." The next morning brought new complications. They were having breakfast when Zeke suddenly tensed, his gaze fixed on the window. "Riders coming," he said quietly. "3 of them." Jolene felt a cold fear grip her. Thatcher's men, possibly. "Quick, there's a cellar trapdoor under the rug by the fireplace. Take some water and stay quiet." She had barely concealed herself in the dark, cramped cellar when she heard boots on the porch and a sharp knock. Through the cracks in the floorboards she could see and hear everything. "Morning, Irwin," came a gruff voice. "Been a while since you showed your face in town." "Been busy with the homestead," Zeke replied evenly. "What brings the sheriff all the way out here, Sheriff?" "Not Thatcher's men directly, but perhaps just as dangerous if in his pocket. Looking for a woman," the sheriff said. "Young, pretty brown hair, stole from her employer and ran off. Name's Jolene Callaway." "Haven't seen anyone fitting that description," Zeke said. "Don't get many visitors out this way. Mind if we have a look around? Mr. Thatcher's mighty concerned about her. Says she's unstable, might hurt herself." "My home is my own, Sheriff. You got a warrant." A tense silence followed. "You know how things work out here, Irwin. Don't need a judge's paper to do what's right." "Maybe not," Zeke replied, his voice hardening. "But you'll need one to search my property, unless you want to explain to the federal marshal why you're breaking the law you're sworn to uphold." Jolene held her breath, certain violence would erupt. "Always were too high and mighty for these parts," the sheriff finally said. "Just remember, Irwin Thatcher has a long memory and longer reach. You cross him, you'll regret it. I'll keep that in mind." After the sound of horses retreating, Zeke opened the cellar door. "They're gone. For now." Jolene climbed out, shaking with relief and fear. "They'll be back, won't they, eventually, with a warrant, real or forged?" Zeke began gathering supplies. "We need to move. It's not safe here anymore. Where can we go? I have a hunting cabin." "It's deep in the mountains. Hard to find if you don't know it's there. We'll head there tonight and figure out our next move." They spent the day preparing, packing food, ammunition, and necessities. Zeke showed Jolene how to use a small revolver, placing it in her hands despite her initial reluctance. "I pray you never need it," he said, "but I want you to have it just in case we're separated." As darkness fell, they saddled the horses and set out, avoiding the main trails and traveling by moonlight. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they climbed into the mountains. Following game trails, Zeke seemed to know by instinct. Near midnight, exhausted and saddle sore, they finally reached the cabin, little more than a one-room shelter built against the side of a cliff, but hidden by a stand of pines and nearly invisible until you were upon it. Inside was sparse but sufficient: a stone fireplace, a small table, a bed frame with a straw tick mattress, and shelves stocked with basic provisions. "It's not much," Zeke apologized as he lit a lantern, "but it's defensible. Only one approach and you can see anyone coming from a quarter-mile away." Jolene sank onto a wooden chair, fatigue making her limbs heavy. "How long can we stay here?" "A few weeks if necessary. Game is plentiful and there's a spring nearby." He busied himself building a fire. "Tomorrow I'll teach you the surroundings so you'll know how to navigate if needed." The reality of their situation hit her fully. "I've completely upended your life," she said quietly. "You've lost your home because of me." Zeke looked at her across the small room, his expression serious. "I haven't lost anything that can't be rebuilt, Jolene. Your freedom isn't something that can be replaced." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and something in his tone made her breath catch. "Try to rest," he said, gentler now. "I'll keep watch." The days that followed established a new routine. Each morning, Zeke would teach Jolene more wilderness skills: how to identify edible plants, how to move silently through the forest, how to use the stars for navigation. In the afternoons, they would work together to improve the cabin's comfort. Adding shelves and a small table made from branches and planks Zeke salvaged from an old deadfall. At night, they would sit by the fire, and Zeke would tell her stories of his law practice or his early days in the territory. Jolene found herself sharing more personal tales as well: her dreams of teaching, her memories of her mother, her hopes for a future different from what her father had planned. On the 8th day at the cabin, Zeke announced he needed to make a trip to a small settlement 3 hours' ride away. "There's a man there who runs the trading post, Jake Miller. He's trustworthy and has connections with the federal marshals. I need to get a message to someone who can help us build a case against Thatcher." "I'll come with you," Jolene said immediately. Zeke shook his head. "Too risky. Thatcher's men could be watching all the settlements. I'll be back by nightfall." Reluctantly, she agreed to stay behind, armed with the revolver and instructions to hide in their prearranged spot if anyone approached. The hours of his absence stretched interminably. Jolene found herself constantly checking the trail for his return, anxiety growing as the afternoon waned with no sign of him. When sunset came and went, genuine fear took hold. She was debating whether to saddle a horse and search for him when she finally heard hoofbeats approaching. Relief flooded through her, quickly replaced by alarm when she realized there were multiple riders. Grabbing the revolver, she slipped out the back of the cabin and into their hiding place, a narrow crevice in the rocks that offered concealment while allowing her to observe the clearing. 4 riders emerged from the trees. Zeke was among them, but he was slumped forward in his saddle, hands tied to the pommel. Blood matted his hair on one side and his face was bruised. The other 3 men were strangers to Jolene, rough-looking with the hard eyes of hired guns. "Search the cabin," ordered the largest of the men. "Thatcher wants the girl alive." As 2 men dismounted and entered the cabin, the leader yanked Zeke from his horse. "Where is she, Irwin? Make this easier on yourself." "Go to hell, Reeves," Zeke spat, earning himself a brutal punch that dropped him to his knees. "Cabin's empty, boss," called one of the men emerging from the structure. "She can't have gone far," Reeves growled. "Search the area, and tie this one to that tree. We'll make him talk." Jolene watched in horror as they secured Zeke to a pine tree, his arms wrenched behind him. One man stayed to guard him while the others began searching the perimeter. Her mind raced. She had the revolver, but there were 3 armed men. She was a decent shot, her father had insisted she learn, but the odds were poor. As one of the searchers drew closer to her hiding place, she made a desperate decision. Moving as quietly as she could, she circled behind the cabin using the rocky terrain as cover. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain they would hear it. When she reached the far side of the clearing, she had a clear view of Zeke and his guard. The other 2 men were still searching in the opposite direction. Taking a deep breath, she raised the revolver with both hands to steady it and aimed at a spot several yards into the trees, away from both her position and Zeke. She fired. The shot echoed through the clearing, causing all 3 men to whirl toward the sound. The 2 searchers immediately headed in that direction, leaving only the guard with Zeke. "What was that?" the guard called nervously. "Probably just spooked a deer," Zeke said, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "Or maybe it's the Apache. They don't take kindly to trespassers in these mountains." The guard's head swiveled anxiously. "Apache? You didn't say nothing about Indians. Didn't think I needed to warn Thatcher's brave men, Zeke replied with obvious mockery. Jolene took aim again, this time at a different spot further from her position. She fired once more. The guard was visibly rattled now. "Reeves," he shouted. "Someone's out there." Jolene seized the moment of confusion to sprint across the edge of the clearing, using the lengthening shadows as cover. She reached Zeke's horse, which was still saddled but loosely tethered to a branch. Untying it quickly, she led it around the periphery of the clearing toward Zeke. The guard had moved several paces away, peering anxiously into the trees where she'd fired. She approached Zeke from behind, knife in hand. "Don't move," she whispered as she began sawing at his bonds. "It's me, Jolene," he breathed. "Get out of here, they'll kill you. Not without you." The rope finally gave way. "Can you ride?" "Yes," he said, flexing his freed hands. "But we need to create a diversion." In the distance, they could hear Reeves and the other searcher crashing through the underbrush, still investigating her shots. Zeke took the revolver from her and fired 3 rapid shots into the air. "That'll confuse them about where the threat is coming from." He swung onto his horse, pulling her up behind him. "Hold tight." They burst from the trees just as the guard turned back toward them, too late to stop their escape. Shouts and gunfire erupted behind them as they galloped down a steep trail Jolene hadn't known existed, switching back and forth down the mountainside at a pace that terrified and exhilarated her. She clung to Zeke, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist, feeling the tension in his body as he guided the horse with expert precision despite his injuries. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit gradually faded as darkness fell, and the terrain worked in their favor. They rode for hours, changing direction frequently, crossing streams to obscure their trail. Zeke finally slowed their pace when the horse began to labor, its sides heaving with exertion. "We need to rest him," he said, his voice ragged with fatigue. "There's a place ahead where we can stop." The place turned out to be a shallow cave set into a hillside, invisible from the trail and sheltered from the wind. Zeke dismounted stiffly, then helped Jolene down, his hands lingering at her waist longer than necessary. "Are you hurt?" she asked, noticing his wince as he moved. "Just bruised." "They caught me outside the trading post. Never made it to Jake." Inside the cave, Zeke wouldn't risk a fire, so they huddled together for warmth, sharing the single blanket from his saddlebag. Jolene examined the wound on his head by touch in the darkness, relieved to find it had stopped bleeding. "That was either very brave or very foolish back there," he said quietly. "I couldn't leave you," she replied simply. "You could have escaped, ridden for help, and left you to Thatcher's men." "No," she shivered, and he drew her closer against his side. "Jolene," he said, his voice suddenly serious. "I need you to know something. If anything happens to me, don't," she interrupted fiercely. "Nothing is going to happen to you. Listen." His hand found hers in the darkness. "There's money hidden at my homestead. Under the hearthstone, there's a metal box with cash and papers enough to get you to Denver or even back east if necessary. We'll go together or not at all," she insisted. In the darkness, she felt him shift, his face now close to hers. "You're the most courageous woman I've ever known," he whispered. Something changed between them in that moment, a shift as palpable as the ground beneath them. Jolene found herself leaning toward him, guided by an impulse she couldn't name. Their lips met in a tentative kiss that quickly deepened, unleashing emotions they'd both been restraining. His arms encircled her, pulling her closer, and she responded with an intensity that surprised them both. When they finally broke apart, breathless, Zeke rested his forehead against hers. "I never intended this," he said softly. "When I cut you free that day, I only meant to help you. And now," she asked, her heart racing, Now I can't imagine my life without you in it." The naked honesty in his voice made her throat tighten with emotion. "I feel the same," she admitted. They held each other through the night, talking quietly of their pasts and cautiously of a future they might share if they survived their present dangers. By morning, Jolene knew with unshakable certainty that whatever happened, her life had been irrevocably changed by meeting Zeke Irwin. At first light, they continued their journey, heading not back toward Zeke's homestead but northeast, toward the territorial capital of Cheyenne. "Thatcher's reach may be long," Zeke explained, "but it has limits. The federal marshal's office in Cheyenne isn't in his pocket. If we can get there and present our case, we have a chance." The journey would take several days, requiring them to skirt settlements and stick to less traveled routes. They stopped only when necessary, always vigilant for signs of pursuit. On the third day, they risked approaching a small farm to purchase supplies. The elderly couple who owned it seemed oblivious to any search for fugitives, and were happy to sell them food and a second horse for Jolene. That night, camped in a sheltered grove by a stream, they allowed themselves to relax slightly. With a small fire for warmth and a proper meal in their stomachs, the desperate flight of the past days seemed less overwhelming. "Tell me about your home in Boston," Jolene requested as they sat side by side, watching the flames. "I've never been to a big city." Zeke smiled, the firelight softening his features. "It's beautiful in its way, all brick and stone with parks and wide avenues. My family had a brownstone near the common. In spring, everything blooms at once, and the whole city smells of flowers for a few weeks. You never speak of your parents. They were good people, traditional. My father was a judge, expected me to follow in his footsteps. When I decided to come west after the war, he was baffled, couldn't understand why anyone would leave civilization for wilderness. And your mother," she understood better, "said sometimes a man needs to find his own path." He stared into the fire. "She gave me her blessing before I left." "Father never did. Do you regret leaving?" Zeke considered this. "No. Despite everything, losing my sister, the hardships, I found something authentic here that I never had in Boston." He turned to look at her, especially now. Jolene blushed under his gaze. "If we reach Cheyenne and manage to clear my name, what then?" "What do you want, Jolene?" he asked gently. She took a deep breath. "Once I thought I wanted to teach school, have a respectable life in town, but now I've seen a different kind of freedom. I don't think I could ever be content with a conventional life again." "And us?" Zeke asked, his voice carefully neutral. "What we've found together, is that part of what you want?" Jolene reached for his hand, twining her fingers with his. "It's the most important part." He lifted her hand to his lips. "Then whatever happens in Cheyenne, we'll face it together." Their arrival in Cheyenne 4 days later was deliberately understated. They entered the city separately, Jolene first, dressed in clothes purchased from a farm wife along the way, and Zeke an hour later by a different route. They reunited at a small boarding house on the outskirts of town, where Zeke had once stayed during his search for his sister. The elderly landlady remembered him fondly and asked no questions when he requested a room for his wife and himself. "We need to move carefully," he told Jolene once they were alone. "Thatcher may have connections here as well. What's our first step?" "I need to locate an old colleague, Samuel Grant. He was a prosecutor I worked with on a case years ago. Last I heard, he'd moved to Cheyenne to work for the territorial government." The next morning, Zeke left to search for Grant while Jolene remained at the boarding house, the revolver hidden in her skirt pocket. The hours of waiting were agonizing, each passing minute increasing her fears that Zeke had been captured or worse. When he finally returned in mid-afternoon, the relief on his face told her he'd had success. I found him, Zeke announced. He's now assistant to the U.S. Marshal for the territory. When I explained our situation, he was outraged. Apparently, Thatcher has been pushing the boundaries of the law for years, but no one's been able to prove anything substantial against him. Will he help us? Yes. He wants to meet you tomorrow to take your formal statement. And there's more, he's already sent telegrams to verify your identity and your father's situation. Hope surged through Jolene. Have they found my father? Is he alive? Grant believes so. According to his sources, your father is recovering in Denver, staying with family friends. After the fire, when you disappeared, he apparently suffered a collapse and was taken there for medical care. Tears sprang to Jolene's eyes. He's alive, she whispered. All this time I feared. Zeke sat beside her on the small bed, his arm around her shoulders. If all goes well with Grant tomorrow, we might be able to reunite you with your father soon. The meeting with Assistant Marshal Grant the next day was both encouraging and sobering. A distinguished man in his 40s with a military bearing, Grant listened intently to Jolene's account of her abduction and sale. What you've described, Miss Callaway, is a serious federal offense, he said when she finished. Human trafficking is explicitly prohibited by law, even here in the territories. What about Thatcher's claim that I'm his property? She asked. Completely without merit. No valid transfer of property could include a human being, not since the 13th Amendment. As for his claim that your father's debts entitled him to take you, that's not just illegal, it's barbaric. So you can arrest Thatcher? Zeke asked. Grant's expression grew more guarded. That's where things get complicated. Thatcher is powerful with friends in the territorial legislature. We need incontrovertible evidence linking him directly to your abduction and sale. The men who took me said they were collecting for him, Jolene offered. Hearsay, Grant sighed. We need documentation or testimony from someone inside Thatcher's organization. What about Harlow, the auctioneer? Zeke suggested. If we could get him to testify about Thatcher's involvement. That's a possibility, Grant acknowledged. But first, we need to ensure Miss Callaway's safety. Thatcher still has men searching for you both. He outlined a plan. Jolene would be escorted to Denver under marshal protection to reunite with her father, while Zeke would work with Grant to gather evidence against Thatcher. No, Jolene said firmly when she understood they would be separated. I won't leave Zeke to face this alone. Miss Callaway, Grant began patiently, this is for your protection. I've been hunted, bound, sold, and nearly recaptured, she interrupted. I'm no stranger to danger now, and I won't abandon the man who saved me. Grant looked to Zeke, expecting support, but found none. She's proven her courage repeatedly, Zeke said simply. I trust her judgment. Reluctantly, Grant modified the plan. Jolene would remain in Cheyenne under protection, but hidden in a safe house rather than the boarding house. Zeke would continue working with Grant, and they would arrange for her father to be brought to Cheyenne as soon as his health permitted travel. That evening, in their room at the boarding house, before moving to the safe house, Jolene and Zeke discussed their future more concretely than ever before. If we succeed in bringing Thatcher to justice, Zeke said, what would you think about rebuilding your father's ranch? With the right legal help, we might be able to challenge Thatcher's claim to the property. You would want that, she asked, surprised, to be a rancher. I want to be wherever you are, he said simply. The profession is secondary. Jolene considered this. What about your homestead? You've put so much work into it. Land is just land, he shrugged. Home is something different, something we build together. The certainty in his voice made her breath catch. Are you asking me to marry you, Zeke Irwin? He took her hands in his. I suppose I am. Not very romantically, I'm afraid. When a man cuts you free from rope bonds and calls you his only to protect you, then risks his life repeatedly to keep you safe." She smiled through sudden tears. "Conventional romance seems rather pale by comparison. Is that a yes?" "It's a yes," she confirmed, leaning forward to seal the promise with a kiss. The next morning, they relocated to the safe house, a modest dwelling on the outskirts of town, owned by a retired judge who was a friend of Grant's. The elderly man and his wife welcomed them warmly, asking few questions and offering genuine hospitality. For the next 2 weeks, Zeke worked closely with Grant, developing a strategy to gather evidence against Thatcher. They identified potential witnesses, including several of Thatcher's former employees who might be persuaded to testify with the right inducements. Harlow, the auctioneer, proved more elusive. He had vanished from Willits shortly after Jolene's sale, reportedly heading for the Dakota Territory. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Grant arrived at the safe house one evening with news that a man named Reynolds had been arrested for drunkenness and assault in a Cheyenne saloon. During his incarceration, he'd boasted of working for Thatcher on special jobs, including the abduction of a rancher's daughter. "He's willing to testify in exchange for leniency," Grant explained. "And he has records of payments from Thatcher for various illegal activities over the past 3 years. Is it enough?" Jolene asked hopefully. "With your testimony and his documentation?" "Yes, I believe we can convince a grand jury to indict Thatcher." 3 days later, a federal marshal escort arrived in Cheyenne with Jolene's father, Joseph Callaway. The reunion was emotional. Her father had aged years in the months since she'd last seen him, his once robust frame now thin and stooped, his hair gone completely gray. "My girl," he wept as he embraced her. "I thought I'd lost you forever." When he learned the full story of her ordeal and rescue, Joseph Callaway's gratitude to Zeke was profound. "I can never repay what you've done," he told the younger man, gripping his hand firmly. "Your daughter saved me as much as I saved her," Zeke replied. "She's extraordinarily brave." Later, when Jolene and her father had time alone, he confirmed what they'd suspected. Thatcher had indeed pressured him into taking loans at exorbitant interest, using the drought as leverage. The fire that destroyed their ranch had been suspicious in its origin, starting simultaneously in 3 separate buildings. "I always believed Thatcher was behind it," Joseph said, "but I couldn't prove anything. When you disappeared, I was half out of my mind with worry. My collapse came when the Sheriff Thatcher's man suggested you'd run off voluntarily." "We're going to bring him to justice, Father," Jolene promised. "And then, I have something to tell you." She explained about her and Zeke, their plans for a future together. Joseph studied his daughter's face. "You love him." "I do, more than I thought possible." "Then you have my blessing," he said simply. "After everything you've endured, your happiness is what matters most to me now." The legal proceedings against Thatcher moved swiftly by frontier standards. The grand jury, presented with Reynolds' documentation and testimony from both Jolene and her father, returned an indictment within a week. Federal marshals rode out to arrest Thatcher at his ranch, only to discover he had fled upon hearing of Reynolds' capture. For 3 tense weeks, Jolene, Zeke, and her father remained under protection in Cheyenne, uncertain whether Thatcher would attempt revenge before he could be apprehended. Grant assigned additional marshals to guard them, and Zeke rarely left Jolene's side. Finally, word came. Thatcher had been captured attempting to cross into Canada. He would be returned to Wyoming Territory to stand trial for multiple federal offenses, including human trafficking, fraud, arson, and attempted murder. "It's over," Zeke told Jolene as they stood on the porch of the safe house, watching the sunset together. "You're truly free now." She leaned against him, savoring the solid strength of his presence. "We both are." With Thatcher in custody and the immediate danger past, they began making plans for their future. Joseph Callaway decided to accept an offer from his friends in Denver to become a partner in their mercantile business, recognizing that his ranching days were behind him. "The land will always be there if you two want to rebuild someday," he told Zeke and Jolene. "Consider it my wedding gift." Their wedding took place in Cheyenne 2 months later, a simple ceremony attended by their new friends Grant and his wife, the elderly couple who had sheltered them, and several of the marshals who had protected them. Joseph Callaway, looking healthier than he had in months, proudly gave his daughter away. Jolene wore a dress of pale blue silk, purchased with some of the restitution funds awarded to her father after Thatcher's conviction. Around her wrists, she wore slender silver bracelets, a gift from Zeke that symbolized the transformation of bonds into something beautiful and freely chosen. After the ceremony, they surprised their guests by announcing they would not be rebuilding the Callaway Ranch immediately. Instead, they planned to return to Zeke's homestead, which had survived Thatcher's men's search relatively intact. "We want to build something that's truly ours," Zeke explained. "Something that represents our future, not our past." 2 weeks later, they crested the familiar hill overlooking Zeke's valley. The cabin stood just as they'd left it months before, though weeds had overtaken the garden and the corral stood empty. "It needs work," Zeke observed as they dismounted. Jolene took his hand, surveying what would now be their home together. "It's perfect. We'll make it our own." That evening, as they sat on the porch watching their first sunset as husband and wife, Zeke pulled a small package from his pocket. "A wedding gift," he explained. "I've been saving it." Inside was a delicate silver chain with a small key pendant. "It was my mother's," he said as he fastened it around her neck. "She gave it to me before I left Boston, said it would help me find what I was looking for out west." "And did you?" Jolene asked, touching the key gently. Zeke's hand covered hers where it rested over the pendant. "More than I ever dreamed possible." Over the next year, they transformed the homestead, expanding the cabin, rebuilding the garden, and adding a small herd of cattle. Joseph Callaway visited twice, pleased to see his daughter thriving in her new life. Thatcher's trial ended with a conviction on all counts and a lengthy prison sentence. His vast holdings were divided and sold, with portions going to those he had wronged, including the Callaways. In the spring of their second year of marriage, as the wildflowers bloomed across the valley, Jolene shared news that brought Zeke to his knees with joy. They would welcome a child before winter. On a crisp October morning, with the aspen leaves turned golden on the mountainsides, their son was born, a healthy boy they named James, after Zeke's father. Standing by the window with his newborn son in his arms, Zeke looked out at the land they had claimed as their own, at the life they had built from the ashes of their separate tragedies. "He'll grow up free," Jolene said softly from the bed. "No ropes, no bonds." "Free and loved," Zeke agreed, returning to her side, "just like his mother." As years passed, their family and homestead prospered. They added a daughter, Elizabeth, 2 years after James, and eventually expanded their property to include a small school where Jolene taught the children of neighboring homesteaders. Zeke occasionally used his legal training to help settlers with land disputes or contracts, earning a reputation for fairness and integrity throughout the region. When Wyoming Territory moved toward statehood, he was asked to help draft portions of the Constitution, a responsibility he accepted with pride. On the 10th anniversary of the day they met, Zeke and Jolene rode together to a hillside overlooking their valley, now dotted with outbuildings, orchards, and grazing cattle. Their children, old enough to ride their own ponies, raced ahead, their laughter carrying on the wind. "Do you ever think about that day?" Zeke asked as they dismounted. "The auction block in Willits," Jolene nodded, absently touching the silver bracelets she still wore on special occasions. "Sometimes, not with fear anymore, but with gratitude." She turned to face him. "If not for those rope burns, we might never have found each other." "I would have found you somehow," Zeke said with certainty, drawing her into his arms. "Some bonds are meant to be." As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the land they had redeemed together, Jolene rested her head against her husband's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, the sound that had become home to her since that dawn when a cowboy cut her free and called her his.